I am very excited to introduce you to our brand new Social Studies Collaborative Inquiry Process, or SCIP. In this process, we have drawn together current theory and research into learning and cognition in order to design this bespoke process that supports students in achieving their full potential as individuals within a team and as teams when inquiring. Now, the aims of the process are to ensure that all students play an active role in collaborative learning, to develop our students' metacognition, their awareness of themselves as learners, their strengths and their needs, to develop our students' thinking skills, to develop our students' research and inquiry skills, and to develop our students' ability to access, scrutinize, and share information in an authentic way. But the idea is that students get to practice and explore these routines and skills explicitly, the routines and skills that are necessary to be efficient and successful learners. Okay, so I wanted to start by explaining how our social studies collaborative inquiry process works. So, first of all, we split our class into small inquiry groups of about 3 to 4 members. Now, research tells us that 3 to 4 is the optimum number of members for collaborative learning, and we should never exceed 6. Once we've created our groups, we can then allocate each member a SCIP inquiry role. And so that would be the fact finder, the analyzer, or the evaluator. Once you've allocated the inquiry roles, you can then allocate the corresponding questions. What are the corresponding questions? Well, I'm glad you asked. Each SCIP inquiry role has a set of corresponding questions. These are linked to different levels on Bloom's taxonomy of higher order thinking. So our fact finder would have the blue set of corresponding questions: who, where, and when. Our analyzer would have the purple set of corresponding questions: does, why, and how, and our evaluator would have the pink set of corresponding questions: which, should, and could. Now, you might want to be quite explicit about the questions that you want them to ask through their inquiry, in which case you can write the questions on the corresponding question cards, or you can display them against the corresponding questions on the flip chart. Okay, so once you have your corresponding questions, it's time to start your inquiry bursts. Now, we're calling them inquiry bursts because we're recommending short blocks of inquiry of 2 to 5 minutes. And these inquiry bursts are followed by sharing sessions where the group come back together and each member takes 1 minute to share what they've already learned. And then that cycle can continue again. Now, the reason for that, those sharing sessions create accountability in the learners, so they're much more motivated to learn. They're also much more motivated because they're coming at the learning from a different perspective. That's what's given to them with the different inquiry roles. So they know they've got something new to bring to the table. They know that they're a driver for learning, not just a passenger. They're also exposed to the learning of other children. And through the discussion, they're able to make lots of deep connections with other areas of learning, and it deepens their understanding of the subject and their ability to apply it. But the main reason for the short bursts of inquiry is what we've learnt about cognitive load theory, which tells us that any person can only learn up to 7 new chunks of information at any one time. So by decreasing the amount of time they spend inquiring and following that with discussion that requires them to recall and retrieve information, what we do is we deepen the pathways and we move those new chunks of information from that working memory into the long-term memory. And then they're able to start again, afresh, and accrue 7 more new chunks of information. Within the social studies collaborative inquiry process, there are 3 different inquiry roles, each with their own corresponding questions. Each of the inquiry roles has its own job description and skill set. So students will be learning how to perform each of these roles adeptly when inquiring. Now, the idea is if the student learns how to perform these roles in year 1 and they practice it through year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, by the time they get to year 6, they'll be able to apply all these roles in their inquiry independently without the need for the rest of the group. But having these different roles teaches them how to learn effectively and efficiently when collaborating. So they're not treading on each other's toes and covering the same ground. They're all bringing something new and unique to the table. These roles are also differentiated. This is a great way of differentiating, and it's differentiated against Bloom's taxonomy of higher order thinking. So our fact finders are working at the level of understanding. Our analysers are working at the level of analysing, and our evaluators are working at the level of evaluation. So, this is a really effective way of evaluating, but also making sure that our learners are collaborating in a way that is efficient and it allows them to drive their own learning forward. They learn about themselves as learners and how to learn more efficiently. Critical thinking is one of the most important elements of learning, and sometimes I think it's more helpful to consider it in terms of higher order thinking. But what is critical thinking? We ask children to do it all the time, but what is it that we're actually asking them to do? Because it's more than the question itself, it's what they do with the question. Well, critical thinking is the ability to analyze and evaluate different forms of information in order to reach an objective judgment or decision. It's quite a big thing to ask a child to do. Now, in my view, children can critically think at any level of schooling. However, we need to make sure that the right structures are in place. And I've been thinking about what components we need in order to cultivate critical thinking. So the first thing that we need in order to have critical thinking is time. Then we also, and it's helpful, it's not entirely necessary, but another thing that's helpful is discussion, collaboration and discussion. The ability to verbalize the ideas, move thoughts into language, which can be really helpful. Also, you benefit from another child's understanding as well. Something that is really important are routines, sequencing and routines. Starting off with just one critical question is very difficult, even for an adult, but children, very difficult indeed. So we need to think about sequencing the questions so that we build down to the critical thinking in stages. And the last thing that we need in order to cultivate critical thinking is safety, a safe environment where somebody can say something that we don't agree with, and that's fine, or can say something that's wrong. When we have all these things in place, what we find is that students are able to be guided through the process of thinking critically and are able to reach a critical conclusion. They're able to reach an objective judgment or decision. It's not just about asking how or why questions. Therefore, in order to support critical thinking in our social studies collaborative inquiry process, we've created skip inquiry pathways, and these work like visible thinking routines. They support and guide the students through the complex process of critical thinking. And these are the corresponding questions for the fact finder, which is the least critical of all the inquiry roles. However, what we're doing is we're teaching the students how to inquire with more detail and more depth. So when we ask who, their inclination is just to give you the name. But what we're then encouraging them to do is we're guiding them to think in more depth. Well, what's their age? What's their character? What were they like? And when we do this, they then build up a profile of the person rather than just details. And of course, there's even greater scope for critical thinking within our analyzer inquiry role. And here we have the analyzer inquiry pathways. Now, the corresponding questions for the analyzer inquiry role are critical. So the students are going to need that support, those routines, that clear pathway in order to get them to think critically and lead them to that objective decision or judgment. And so here's an example. So if we're asking the question why did so and so do so and so? We might start by encouraging them to note down all of the actions. Now that's not critical thinking, but it is a stepping stone on the critical thinking process. So they note down all the actions that the person did. Then we ask them to note down all the possible motivations, but considering all that work that they've done, noting down the actions. So they have to evaluate the actions in order to consider the motivations. And then, finally, you ask them to make their interpretation. And you teach them through this process how to think critically, to break the question down into the necessary steps. Now, these are a template and they're editable, so you can put in your own routines, your own pathways. You can also put visible thinking routines into these pathways. So if you look at the wood pathway, that's essentially a circle of viewpoints.
Now, one of the things that I remember finding just a little bit frustrating when I first started trying to teach with a student-led inquiry approach was that often when I made my assessment at the end of the lesson, I was a bit disappointed by how much of the content they'd managed to acquire. Now, I promise you, I actively facilitated, I didn't just sit at the desk, and I taught explicit skills like note-taking, etc. But quite often, at the end of the lesson, the students hadn't actually learnt that much. And I reflected, why is that?
And then I came across this quote: memory is the residue of thought. And it actually really resonated with me. I suddenly thought, well, yes, I'm not really asking them to do anything with the information as it comes in, because students have got to do something with the information. They've got to think about it, they've got to process it. The information comes in through the channels of visual and audio, and it moves into the working memory. And that's where it's processed. If you're not having those thought processes, it doesn't embed it, it doesn't move it into the long-term memory. So we need to make sure that we are properly processing as we're receiving information in order to retain it. And that's what was missing from my inquiry. That's why we created this inquiry processing and encoding activity menu. Now, the purpose of each of these activities is that it requires the student to really think about their learning as they're learning it. You see, the thing about just taking notes is that it doesn't require a lot of thinking. It doesn't require a lot of processing. The information and the words come in through the audio and visual channels, and they stay in that working memory. It doesn't require a lot of processing just to put down a few key words. But these activities require the student to interpret the information in some way, and that's much deeper. That requires a lot more processing. And so the information comes in and it moves through the working memory into the long-term memory, which is much better for the learners. And the best thing about this is that each of these activities requires the learner to interpret the information, express the information in a different way. So students learn about themselves as learners. They learn which of these suits them as a learner, which allows them to learn more efficiently. So it develops the learner's metacognition.